One of the basic rules of biblical interpretation, in fact, the interpretation of any historical text, is that, first of all, before we can understand the text, we need to understand what was going on around it. What was happening in society, in the culture at that time? What was the thinking that was abroad? What stories were being told? What might have been influencing the writer to think in a particular way, to be motivated in a certain way before they put pen to paper? And nowhere is this more true than when we're talking about the resurrection story. What was in the culture at the time of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul? What was happening around the world? Was the resurrection story, as we tell it on Easter morning, was that all that we know about resurrection, or were there other such stories? And so my question today that I'd like to address is, was only Jesus raised from the dead? Well, you might have guessed from my introduction that, in fact, there were other resurrection stories. And I think this came to our attention in the 20th century, mainly because of the writing of a Scottish anthropologist by the name of James Fraser. He wrote a book called The Golden Bough in 1922. And in it, he talks about how in the ancient Near East, where the Bible was written, stories of divine death and resurrection were closely tied with the agricultural cycle. And Fraser believed that early Christians probably chose a spring date for Easter because it coincided with the pagan festivals for their resurrected gods. He concludes in his book, taken all together, the coincidences of the Christian with the heathen festivals are too close and too numerous to be accidental. Now, some people have taken that as implying that the resurrection of Jesus, therefore, was simply a pagan festival, and that it was adopted by Christians because it served the purpose of stamping the divine on the life of Jesus. Years ago, I remember listening to HARPUR, who used to be the rector of St. Margaret's in the Pines in Scarborough, and he became the religion editor of the Toronto Star. And he used to write about this, and I went to several of his talks where he was describing how around the world, not just in the Middle East, but around the world, there are many stories about how gods were resurrected. And so I'd like to just take a look at a few of those right now with you, so you can get a sense of the other stories of resurrection. So let's start with Mesopotamia. In that particular region of the world, Ishtar was the great mother goddess and the source of nature's fertility and abundance. Her lover was Tammuz, a handsome young god who died each winter and passed away into the shadowy underworld. For 6 months of the year, Ishtar traveled to the realm of the dead to rescue her lover. During that time, the world was robbed of all fertility, reproduction, and growth. Now, in the absence of scientific knowledge, Who's to say that they were wrong in developing a story like that? It made sense of why things died and why they came back to life again in the spring. Well, every spring, the stern goddess of the underworld, Alatu, would allow the imprisoned couple to be sprinkled with the water of life and return to the world of the living, bringing life and green vegetation back to the earth. In the Babylonian calendar, the resurrection was celebrated during Du'utsu, or the month of Tammuz, which fell in late June or early July. Now, all across the ancient Near East, other pagan cultures were celebrating something very similar. For instance, the Phrygians told the tale of Attis, who was brought back to life on the spring equinox by Sibyl, the fertility goddess. The Greeks told the myth of Persephone, who was kidnapped by Hades and allowed to return every spring from the underworld, heralding the return of vegetation and grain production. So that's Mesopotamia and that region of the world. A name that you might have heard of is Osiris. He was an Egyptian god, and according to mythology, Osiris once ruled the earth alongside the queen, Isis, the fertility goddess. But Osiris was tricked and murdered by his brother Set, who chopped up Osiris's body and scattered his remains across Egypt. Isis reassembled Osiris's body, anointed it with oil, and performed elaborate rites of embalming, which resurrected Osiris to eternal life as the god of the underworld. The ancient pharaohs, hoping to become immortal themselves, used to use embalming and mummification rituals that Isis used to resurrect Osiris. In time, even common Egyptians chose to be mummified in the hopes of overcoming death, just as Osiris had done. You may remember years ago, I think it must be about 30 years ago, there was an exhibition at the Royal Ontario Museum of some of the artifacts that were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. And Tutankhamun wore a funerary mask which was in the likeness of Osiris. In India, there's at least one story, a beloved story of resurrection. According to Hindu tradition, there was once a clever and beautiful princess named Savitri who refused to marry any of the suitors who were clamoring for her hand. She departed her palace in search of her true love and found Satyavan, a handsome woodsman who was once a prince. Savitri and Satyavan fell in love and they married. But a messenger from the gods delivered a terrible prophecy. Satyavan would die in exactly 1 year. And as promised, on the young couple's first anniversary, Satyavan collapsed and died. Yamraj, the god of death, came to claim Satyavan's soul. But clever Savitri had a plan. She doggedly followed Yamraj across the burning desert and to the entrance to the underworld, begging for the return of Satyavan. Yamraj agreed to grant Savitri one wish, but not for her husband's life. Savitri asked that she be granted the gift of many children. When Yamraj accepted, she asked him, "So how am I supposed to bear children if I don't have a husband?" And I made a pledge that I would only marry Satyavan. So, unable to resist this logic, Yamraj had to return Savitri's husband, and he kept his word. Satyavan was brought back to life, and the young couple were reunited. I think my favorite of all of the stories is the Buddhist story of Bodhidharma. and his single shoe. Now, according to Buddhist tradition, the figure known as Bodhidharma was a great sage who may have been the first to bring Buddhism to China. In the Zen Buddhist tradition, Bodhidharma often plays the role of the wise and wily Zen master, challenging his students with cryptic riddles that, if deciphered, lead along the path of enlightenment. Well, one day, a Chinese diplomat by the name of Songyun was crossing the Pamir Mountains between China and India when he passed the now elderly Bodhidharma walking in the opposite direction. Songyun asked where the master was going, and Bodhidharma replied that he was finally going home to India. Then Songyun noticed that Bodhidharma was only wearing one shoe, and he asked why. Bodhidharma suggested that Songyun ask the monks when he arrived in Shaolin. The men parted ways, but when Songyun asked about Bodhidharma's shoe in Shaolin, he was thrown in jail for lying. What was he lying about? Well, apparently Bodhidharma had died years before, and he didn't know it. And they thought that he was trying to create some kind of a scam by telling them that he was still alive. But several years later, in order to prove that Bodhidharma had died, they opened up his tomb, and all they found was a single shoe. In other words, Bodhidharma had left behind a shoe, which is why he was wearing the one shoe when he was met on his way to India. In depictions of Bodhidharma, he is often shown as being barefoot and carrying a single shoe on a stick. I love that. And it's very similar to the story of the empty tomb. The tomb of Bodhidharma was empty, and instead of grave cloths, a shoe was found. So there's some resemblance there. I'm not saying that one influenced the other, but just that it's interesting that another culture came up with a very similar story. And then we go to Norse mythology, and you've, I'm sure, heard of Odin. Odin is the chief among the gods of Valhalla. He's the creator god whose wisdom and wizardry was unmatched. But Odin had to pay a terrible price to achieve his powerful and esoteric knowledge. According to Norse legend, the greatest sources of wisdom in the ancient world were the runes, magic symbols that not even the gods could decipher. But Odin was willing to do whatever was necessary, even face death itself, to untangle the meaning of the runes and access their hidden power. According to the epic Viking poem Havami, Odin subjected himself to a violent form of self-sacrifice. I'm quoting here, "myself to my own self given." Wow, that sounds like the cross, doesn't it? Myself to my own self given. He was pierced in the side with a spear, just as Christ was pierced, and he forbade any of the other gods to come to his aid, just as Jesus refused to exercise his divine prerogative and simply died as one of us, a mortal man. For 9 days, Odin hung from the tree, not a cross, but a tree, staring down at the watery depths of the well of Urd, until finally, on the 9th day, the forms of the runes were revealed to him. So he finally was able to receive that esoteric knowledge that he was looking for. In the language and imagery of the Havami, part of Odin died in that 9-day ordeal, but he was reborn or resurrected as a far more powerful being with newfound knowledge and abilities. The similarity there to the death, resurrection of Jesus is so close that it's almost like a retelling. It's like different words are being used, but it's the same story. And yet these are two very distinct cultures. And there's no indication, no evidence that one was influenced by the other. I think I'll conclude with another story from Mesoamerica. Now, there are countless stories of death and resurrection of gods in the world. I'm just going to choose this one from the Americas. And I'm sure you've heard of him and you've seen images of him, Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl, wonderful name. In ancient Mesoamerica, he was the greatest of the gods. He was the feathered serpent, worshipped across the centuries of Mayan, Toltec, and Aztec civilizations. In some traditions, Quetzalcoatl was an Osiris-like figure, the god of agriculture and vegetation, closely associated with the rain god Tlaloc. And like Osiris, Quetzalcoatl was deceived by his brother. Something here that resembles the betrayal of Judas. Deceit, betrayal. He was deceived by his brother into drinking a powerful intoxicant and sleeping with a priestess. Overcome with guilt, Quetzalcoatl killed himself through self-immolation. But he rose again to life. Quetzalcoatl became the god of death and rebirth. The god of death and of new life. As creator god, Quetzalcoatl also descended to the underworld, just as Jesus descended to the underworld for 3 days. He went there to collect the bones necessary to make the first human beings. Fascinating stories, aren't they? They're not the same. They're not copying each other. And yet it seems that all of these cultures, and so many more that I haven't mentioned, intuitively understand this concept of death, resurrection, new life. And I want to look at one last story, and this one is from the Bible itself. It's from Matthew 27, verses 52 to 53. I'm accustomed to hearing, as I'm sure you are, on Easter Day, about the resurrection of Jesus as if this was a singular event. In fact, I've often heard preachers say, in all of human history, only one man was ever raised from the dead. But listen to this. Jesus is hanging from the cross. He cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now, you don't hear about that very much in sermons, do you? And I think the reason that preachers tend to sidestep this passage, not always, but usually, is because it confuses people. If we're thinking about the resurrection of Jesus, about how his tomb was broken open, the stone rolled away, we don't want to confuse our minds with other such stories that are being told by the gospel writers. And also, theologians are at odds as to what this passage is all about, whether it even belongs in the Gospel of Matthew. There's been heated debate over the centuries. But think about the details of this. We're not told that ghosts came out of the tombs, sort of apparitions, and that they kind of floated around Jerusalem. But we're told that they were raised from the dead in exactly the same way as Jesus was. Their tombs were opened, just as Jesus' tomb was open. They came forth from the tombs, and they entered the holy city, and just as Jesus did, they appeared to many. What do you make of that? I've often thought I'd like to write a book, a fictional book, in which I look at some of the stories of these individuals who were raised from their tombs, the conversations that they had with their loved ones and friends when they returned to them. Did they sit at meal tables as Jesus did with his disciples? Did they join people who were on a walk, such as Cleopas and his companion on the walk to Emmaus? What are the stories we're not told? Okay, so what I've done today is I've looked at various stories of death and resurrection. And my point in doing this is not to shake your faith, but rather to say that the resurrection of Jesus is something which has been in the imagination of human beings for a long time. And as I said in our first study on the resurrection, there is a lot of dispute even between the gospel writers as to the details of the resurrection. The only things that they seem to agree on is that the tomb was found to be empty by women, the stone rolled away, and that Jesus appeared to his disciples. All the rest about angels and earthquakes and guards running away, they seem to disagree on those details. So a bare bones account of the resurrection is simply that the tomb was found empty and that the disciples had an experience afterwards that changed their lives forever, which caused them to pick up and even leave their homeland and travel throughout the world, sharing the gospel of the death, resurrection of Jesus. I think at Easter we spend too much time thinking about how amazing and miraculous and strange the resurrection was. We're human. We like extravaganzas. We love mysteries. And if something seems to go against natural law, it intrigues us. We sit around and everyone is hushed as they listen to stories of people coming back from the dead. But I don't think that's primarily what Easter is about at all. I don't think it's meant to be a miracle that wows us into believing. In other words, as some preachers say, we believe because Jesus was raised from the dead. We believe because such an incredible miracle that had never occurred before took place in Israel back in 33 AD, that therefore Jesus must be divine. Well, I don't think that that's the reason for the resurrection. My focus is rather upon the disciples' lives. What I find truly miraculous is that such ordinary men and women could have their lives turned inside out, upside down, that they could have left everything that they held familiar, risked everything, and stepped out into the world to preach this message. Last week I spoke about everything that the Apostle Paul gave up in order to preach this message, how he wanted to be absolutely sure that it had occurred, and so he had gone back to Jerusalem to interview Simon the Apostle and James the brother of Jesus in order to get a first-hand account of what had occurred in Jerusalem a few years before. So people's lives were changed, and that's my focus at Easter, is the new life that we can experience, the new quality of life, a new way of looking at the world, a new world order, a new way forward in a sometimes confusing and depressing world, a way to have hope. Because Jesus, in some way, burst forth from that tomb. Well, I hope your week has been going well, and the weather's slowly warming up. God bless, and keep safe.